is Ron Warman. Welcome to the second in a series of monthly webinars featuring great conversations in security. I am the managing director of the SAGE Group and the producer of the Great Conversation Forum that takes place every spring, this spring, March 5th and 6th, in the beautiful waterfront downtown Seattle, Washington. Today's conversation is entitled The Insecurity of Security, the 2017 Landscape. We have two gentlemen with great pedigrees that can handle this conversation. They also were featured on the main stage this last March in the Great Conversation on the same subject. And we're going to be talking about not only what they talked about in March, but also what they're continuing to study and reflect on leading up to the next Great Conversation. First, I want to introduce Rodney Thayer. He's a convergent engineering consultant at Smithy Solutions. At the end of the day, he provides consulting on cyber networks for physical security infrastructures. Welcome, Rodney.
Thank you.
And then William Plant is a principal consultant with the Enterprise Security Risk Group at Aronson Security Group. William is a former chief security officer, as well as principal consultant in IT engineering and operations in infrastructure resilience. Welcome, William.
And good afternoon from the Blue Ridge Mountains, Ron.
The Blue Ridge Mountains, we've seen examples of that, and that will be a special treat for anyone who wants to log in later. Our last conversation in March underlined the fact that our ecosystem had been taken by surprise by the threat to their physical security systems. Since that time, it seems the pressure's only increasing. Isn't that right, Rodney?
Yes, the way we see it is we had issues before where people were just barely beginning to recognize it, sort of like the frog in the pot of warm water. And sort of the summary, the executive summary, what's happened since March is the water's just getting hotter, and the frog may or may not have figured it out yet.
Well, it's interesting in that parable of the frog, if you will. Frog isn't even aware the water's boiling. Is that, in your estimation, is that happening in some segments of our industry?
I think it is. I think some vendors are starting to get it, but in general, we're still having issues with people not quite seeing it. It's getting better, but we're having awareness issues.
Awareness issues. Well, let's talk about what we talked about on March on the main stage of the Great Conversation. It seems to me you guys first pointed out that there were definitive risks and vulnerabilities that had been uncovered on physical security systems. And those were attacking not just cameras, because that seems to be in the news a lot, but also access panels, intrusion, IP communications. Any comments on that?
Yeah, Ron. So we thought about this when we originally presented in March because this is a very broad topic, and the fact of the matter is when you look at our systems, our studies, architecture, present. And
excuse me, just for a moment, William. It sounds like your sound is a little off. Why don't we try it again? It looks like you were about to comment on the fact that these risks and vulnerabilities are applied across the spectrum of different technologies. Go ahead. Let's see if we can pick you up again.
Yeah, my apologies. Yeah, so all that I was saying is that we have a lot of systems that are going into new types of architectures, and all of these architectures have concerns. And so we have to be very thoughtful about how we bring them forward.
Got it. And obviously, this includes not only the emerging the existing technologies, but also the emerging technologies as well. IoT, cloud, IPv6. And to Rodney's point, what was really interesting about that conversation, I found, we had about 300 people in the room, and it was across the entire ecosystem. Can you explain what ecosystem means when we refer to that, William?
Sure. So what we mean by that is that from the point in which manufacturers are beginning to manufacture their technology, the risk consultants that help identify how these systems are applied, the integrators that help to install them, and the clients and how they manage them, that represents an entire ecosystem, and we all own a part of the problem.
Absolutely. Well, since that
I would also add that we have these things interact with each other like an ecosystem. They don't stand alone. So what happens to the cameras can relate to what happens to the access control.
Or to your point, when we're all together here, when we've got a risk consultant in the room, and we've got an integrator in the room and a technology vendor in the room, there can be a lot of finger pointing. And the client's looking around them going, who owns this? What throat can I choke on this one? And the answer is the ecosystem. Is that what we're saying?
I think we all share it.
Yeah, I agree with Rodney. It's to the degree that we all share it. That's quite true. But I think that as an ecosystem, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but we've got to understand where the common problems are and who the most natural source to take charge of some of these problems are. It's kind of dangerous when a client, an end user says, well, I thought the integrator had that, and you get a blank stare. So there's a lot of conversation that needs to continue to occur to help make this problem solvable.
And there's a new language to learn. It was evident to me, Rodney, you can tell it's bad when this slide right here, you're using language that isn't necessarily understood by that ecosystem. But let's go through how bad is it out there, Rodney? How bad is it?
We have lots of technical terms that have snuck into the language here. We used to call them just technical buzzwords, but I claim when the announcers on National Public Radio are spouting off these terms in the news reports that maybe it's gone mainstream. So as an example, you can tell it's bad when something like Wired Magazine actually has a standing section on botnets. These are compromised machines that have been taken over by malicious parties to do bad things as a group. So there's a botnet section. If you want to look up what's going on today on that subject, you can just go to that section of the news, sort of like the sports section or the business section.
Mm-hmm. And just recently, I was working with a client, Ron, and talking to their CISO, and we're talking about how to configure a new video platform on the network, and he just looked at me and said, your cameras are network hostile objects. And that completely changed the tone of the conversation and the design approach that we'd be taking. That would not have happened maybe 5 years ago.
And you can
so you
go ahead, Ron.
No, that's fine.
You get
just
this. So we get this divergence between the various parties. So the IT practitioners, the information security practitioners are worried about the hostile objects, and the other parts of the ecosystem, the vendors bidding this equipment, they may not even realize that they're bidding equipment that could be known to be vulnerable. So this is the reference to a CVE, a Common Vulnerability and Exposures. This is a U.S. government-sponsored public mechanism for people to identify issues with devices. So you don't want to get caught bidding a camera that has a CVE number already.
And it looks like that's, of course, a free information resource as well if people want to refer it. Is that correct, Rodney?
That's correct.
And then finally, and by the way, everyone out there, this is a fireside chat, but there is a delay between signals, and that's why you're hearing us in awkward moments trying to talk over each other. But real quick, William, on that CVE webpage, tell us a little bit more about that.
So I think there's a couple of points to make. One is that it's a publicly available piece of information, and anybody that's concerned with the design and operation, especially in this case a video system, needs to take a look at that from time to time. There's a lot of concern about video especially. In one particular case, and again, these are live examples, we had to do an extraordinary cable design for a video network for the pieces of the camera network that were going to be outside the physical perimeter of the building. And we sat down with the client and their CISO to explain, here's what we're going to do for these concerns. And they wanted to understand about these CVEs and what could we as an integrator do. And so that, again, sparked a real conversation. It's an ecosystem problem, not just an integrator or an end user in this case.
Mm-hmm. So you're actually being asked questions about this today. So are you essentially suggesting at this point, this conversation is for integrators, consultants, it's for the entire ecosystem? You're suggesting at this point that both consultants and integrators have to be ready for that conversation.
Yeah, you've absolutely nailed it, Rob. As Rodney's kind of alluding to, even getting a new language adopted takes a little bit of work and education. This is it takes a little bit of time. But then secondly, it's an education process across the entire ecosystem. The problems that a CISO will understand on a network are not necessarily ones that the manufacturer will understand when they're beginning to put together a video program. And so how do you make that connection? I mean, where is it done? Who takes responsibility for that? And I would argue that because it's an ecosystem problem, there's got to be an ecosystem approach to identifying how to deal with the whole problem. Yeah.
Well, then all of this is cascading. So we have this situation here where you threw out another term the other day to me, and that is this input flows into a data lake. Tell us what that means.
So a data lake is a variation on the term describing a large amount of information gathered together. Generally, people are trying to do good things with it. Usually you see the term big data, which will apply to you have a huge amount of information and you're doing something to analyze it, manipulate it to do something useful. So if you meant to have all that data flowing into a data lake, that's fine. Now you've got all this stuff connected together and in one place. So now if you have a huge amount of information, you need to be aware that you've got that lake forming, whether you meant to or not. And so now we have an information asset, and so suddenly we have another thing we have to worry about securing. So this goes back to the security question of have we accidentally added more risks to the environment because of things we're doing? So when we start to have IP-enabled light bulbs and all sorts of crazy things, all that information is going to flow somewhere. So one of the takeaways we're getting is that be careful if there's input flowing to the data lake.
And I would imagine too the downstream implications, if you will, are incredibly unpredictable.
That's correct. Bad things could happen.
Just as an interesting example, Ron, we are having discussions with another IT organization. We're running through the various places that, in our case, our security data could rest. Would it be on servers on premise? Would they be centrally located? Would that be, in fact, off on the cloud somewhere? And so they looked at the data as data. They knew there'd have to be some protection around it, but we explained that let's talk about what this data is. It's not like all the other data you have. And that, again, changed the conversation because we said if it's going to go somewhere, we have to know that it's completely protected with these kind of characteristics. Sometimes the people that deal with data just say, I want a place where I can stick it somewhere. And be less concerned about the type. And in our case, we're very concerned that the type of data we have is very, very sensitive and it can't get out.
So really what you're doing today, much differently than you did 10 years ago, is you're not designing a technology implementation anymore. You're actually aligning processes, tools, and a data model. You have to understand where this data is going and how it will be utilized. That I don't see anyone in the marketplace actually aligning a data process model with an actual business process model. Is that happening out there?
I'll take a first crack at it. And Rodney, I'd love to hear what your experiences are like. 10 years ago, you would never have this conversation. Again, the video systems and the security systems, their data was either on-prem or even offline in some ways, on their own system. But because we wanted to leverage the IT infrastructures that are available to us now to basically have cost efficiencies, that meant that we needed to align the design of our physical security systems with the IT strategies these companies are having. When you do that, there is a momentum to follow. And then all of a sudden, you need to be able to say, well, we don't think it's a good idea to put ourselves into the cloud, and here's why, if it's talking about video, for instance. So, yeah, it's a very broad conversation now. And systems design isn't, well, let's just put sensors out into the field and start collecting this data and integrate it all. It's how's it going to be used, where's it going to be stored, and what's the value of this data to somebody that's hostile to the company? That's one of the questions we now ask. What happens when it gets out?
It's very interesting to me to see the various reactions. This idea that it can't happen here is kind of showing up lately in some of the results we're seeing in the marketplace. No one would have ever thought that the business model of Equifax could be breached since they were supposedly experts in protecting our data. What happened here?
So what happened here is, as far as we know, is that there was a simple process breakdown on some equipment being updated. And because the bad guys are more vigilant than the good guys, in some cases, somebody found a path through that to compromise their systems. Because it's a data breach, we're all watching this forest fire from a distance. So as near as we can tell, there were some process failures, and that led to some breaches. And as we learn more and more, the story's not getting much better. I mean, the most recent news reports I've seen is that they're now talking about how they're about to start encrypting the data, which implies it wasn't encrypted before. They had this big data lake, and they were just apparently spending a lot of time thinking about how they could use the information in it, and perhaps not thinking enough about the fact that the data model and the fact that there's implications if it were compromised.
And then you go from a process breakdown to a device breakdown.
Yeah, so this is I call this Camerageddon 2, because we keep having these events or supposed events around issues with network outages caused by large numbers of machines, these botnets. So we had the Mirai botnet several months ago. There's another one that's been talked about called Reaper. And what the basic issue is the bad guys have, after Mirai, where they had some relatively new information on how to hack things, cameras and the video recorders and other devices, they've gone back and done their homework on all the old CVE numbers from years and years and years and gone by and identified equipment that's vulnerable to known problems. So this is the situation where the technology either is outdated or somehow wasn't tested or wasn't stress tested sufficiently, and that's caused there to be equipment which is vulnerable, which is accessible from the public internet, and bad guys are grabbing these things, and to use the jargon, they're making machines into zombies, and someday the zombies will activate and they'll have a botnet. They can do some large attack against somebody.
Right.
And
so now you've got. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I was going to mention, two things. The most prominent examples right now where video is being compromised and botnets launched have been out to other, like other companies or other entities. But no company wants to be on the Wall Street Journal headline news as a botnet was launched against itself. That, as bad as it is, that would be even worse. And so those are now some of the concerns that we're thinking about. And then secondly, there are some really important been WASP, for instance, that allow compromises to occur. And so we're defending against that. But also, what it tells us is we have to redouble our efforts, that ultimately compromises tend to come more internally or from an internal source than external. And so no matter the fact that we focus on these emerging threats, the fact of the matter is, and it's still a problem with people in the end. And so I want to make that point.
Well, it also looks like zombies. The data is turning into zombies. What did you mean by that, Rodney? Are zombies real?
A zombie, in this case, the reference is that some outside force has taken over the body of something and taken control of it. So like your zombie movie where, bugs from an alien planet show up and take over all the left-handed people. So the zombies are in this case, the devices, the cameras, the IoT devices that are supposed to be under control of their users, but in fact are being controlled by some malicious third party somewhere out in the internet who's compromised it and can remotely command it to do things.
All right, gentlemen. So we've got the threat. Thank you. So gentlemen, we're at the point where we need some advice, which is kind of a lead-in to the forum in March. But help us out a little bit. Let's go back to that ecosystem here. Let's work our way around the wheel here, and let's start with the tip of the needle, the risk consultant who comes in to not only assess the environment for the end user, but also helps them strategically align their plan. What's going on there, William? What should be going on there?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the risk consultants, and I think Rodney has some good points about the specifiers. So the first thing is that it's incumbent upon risk consultants, especially ones that are helping companies designing their systems from an application perspective, put a sensor here, put a camera there, that type of thing, that when they're being engaged, if they hear that there are practices like, well, we don't upgrade our systems or they're really old, that should be a tell. And it would be incumbent upon the risk consultant to turn back to the client and say, this may or it may not be my area of speciality, but you should be speaking to your IT folks to talk about management practices that should apply to your systems, like configuration and change management and problem management, these types of things. Because sometimes it's just the right ear picks up and goes, I'm not an expert in that, but I know there's a problem. And but also they should become a little bit more educated, really begin to understand from an ecosystem view where these problems are, what's beginning to happen, and they should have an opinion about, in their case, the responsibility they should take to help their clients begin to address these problems, because that's where the problems, I think, need to get started from a fixed perspective.
And Rodney?
So, following the conventional flow of things, the specifiers are intended to be taking the customer's requirements and defining how the vendor supply chain can deliver on that. So, just like specifiers have always done, looking at things at like where are your threats and what kind of risks do you have, they need to start incorporating these kinds of risks into the specifications they're writing. And that includes both identifying that customers have requirements, for example, to be encrypting data. And it also would mean that because the specification process is both how do you look at what the customer wanted and how do you go implement that. So that has to follow all the way through to specifying what they want the vendor supply chain to deliver, probably even including what tests they should do at the end of the process to confirm that it's secure. If you sold them a door lock, you'd make sure the door locks. So we need to be doing the same sort of thing.
And then, what should integrators be doing, William?
Sure. So first of all, when we start working with clients, speaking on the integrator side for a second, that they really need to have a solid cybersecurity plan, and they form that plan. It's never good enough to, as I said, install this stuff, turn it on, and then it's working. That the way in which these systems are set up on the network and all of the encryption keys that need to be set, they need to be set, and they need to be demonstrated that, yes, we've made these changes, and that there's some kind of a plan on a quarterly basis or on an annual basis to do certain things to make sure that the system still maintains its integrity. And for the things that they don't do themselves, they need to be able to say, we don't do this, but we do know that your IT security folks should be helping you with this. And so take some responsibility for the intent of the integrity of your systems, not just to get it in, I change my keys and my job is done. That's just getting started, in my opinion.
Any additional comments, Rodney?
I think that the other thing about what the clients need to do is make sure they communicate this stuff to the integrators. If you're starting from the beginning here, the things the integrators I would add is they need to be able to handle the cyber awareness question, and sometimes that means go hire some more people. But what I really mean is, since the integrators are often treated as a form of trusted advisor, you need to be prepared to have the conversation with the customers and with the other stakeholders to make sure that you're aware of trying to make sure things are being done safely. And to that end, they need to make sure they're capable of working with the IT security and the IT folks, either their own internal or the customers or other vendors, to actually work together on these things, because all of this stuff, it's an ecosystem. It all interconnects with each other.
And excuse me, but what should the technology vendors, otherwise known as the manufacturers, what should they be doing?
Sure, I'll start. You're beginning to see this now. Manufacturers are putting information on their website about commonly understood vulnerabilities or concerns. One manufacturer that I saw had information about Wigan Protocol and the fact that that was a hack technology, and that really end users should be looking at CIOS credentials as an example. But then secondly, they must have a position on cybersecurity and the hardening guidelines. They have to. Otherwise, trying to install and configure these things without manufacturer's guidance is an iffy proposition at best. And then I think they still need to publish more material on the problems and best practices and solutions. They are in an excellent position from the ecosystem perspective to help generate a conversation, to help formulate strategies. They're certainly not the only participant, but they are one of the most critical stakeholders in solving the problem, in my opinion.
Ready?
So what I would add is that the manufacturers need to be looking at places where standards can help solve these issues or address them. This kind of stuff is, the cybersecurity issues are common across all sorts of vendors, and this is not something that would interfere with vendor diversity. So I'm not saying all the camera vendors only suddenly have to sell the same thing. There's some example standards are UL's 2900 series, which is cybersecurity validation from Underwriter Laboratories, which is probably going to be very, very stringent and not cheap, but something people would want to look at doing as a possible way of certifying that products have been tested reasonably. There's some other standards in the industry that support this. OSCP is a mechanism for having readers and panels interact with each other, and it can apply security, so you can now have encryption and a supervised connection, so that becomes more secure, and so a standard would support that. And the ODVIF standard has components in it to support configuring devices in a reasonable manner and trying to use them securely. So there are some standards out there. The specification process is evolving. The Division 28 section, if we're talking CSI section numbers now, Division 28 has a section on cybersecurity now. It's 280511, if you look at the numbers. And so now there is a mechanism for asking for specifiers to communicate what things people should be doing when they're deploying systems to actually make sure they get secured properly. Manufacturers should have a hardening guide. They or some kind of guidance that it should offer to their customers. Not everybody's going to use it, but it should be available so that you have the option to do that sort of thing. Another thing that manufacturers are doing now is they are using bounty programs. There are responsible, well-organized organizations that have set up mechanisms for security researchers out in the wild to register and then communicate with vendors who are aware their equipment is going to get tested, and they actually pay out bounties. So I'm registered in a couple of these systems. I've gotten bounty money from Google, for example, so that this turns out as a good mechanism to identify, an additional mechanism to identify issues and to enhance your product testing process. And sort of the last thing is that the vendors have to bake more cyber capabilities into their product. They have to be more resilient. They have to follow an approach where they're communicating things, and the vendors have to worry about this. They can't ignore this subject.
And finally, gentlemen, the end user. They're part of the ecosystem and they share responsibility.
Sure. Just looking at our time, so I'll make this really quick. So first of all, obviously they need to be better educated in physical security systems and cybersecurity issues. They have to become educated from their IT peers in the company, as well as from risk consultants and integrators especially. Key to work with IT teams and apply hosting and config and change management information. And I recommend that they use the information technology infrastructure library practices. It's world-class, best stuff. It's not foolproof by any sense, but it's a very structured way to start managing your systems in a way that IT organizations typically do. And then the last one is just assessing the hygiene of your system and planning for better process and technical improvements. You know, every little thing that you do is one better thing that you're getting accomplished. And so if you have a plan and a program and it's organized and it's aligned with your IT folks, your integrators are involved, and your risk consultants, you're going to go a long way to improving the security of your own security system.
Buddy?
And so I guess I would, yeah, we're short on time. You need to include cyber issues when you're thinking about your total cost of ownership. So buying the cheap equipment up front and discovering you have issues later can not make it worth the money to save the money up front. And you should be using guidelines to identify what things you want. And then there's various mechanisms from the vendors that can help you with that.
Outstanding. As you can see, our guest speakers here, we're all worried about keeping you, but one more minute. Sounds like there's still a problem. It's getting more critical, and you're flagging, each of you, that this needs to be taken seriously across the ecosystem. If there is a disconnect in the ecosystem, you're urging end users to monitor and measure that. And I'd be interested later on at the great conversation how you would do that. But this gets started now for everybody. It looks like it's incumbent on each member of the ecosystem to develop a scorecard to really measure yourself, and the end user measure yourself and your vendors with a trusted advisor. Tell me about that.
So I'm a personal big believer in establishing a benchmark or some kind of measure by which you measure a program or performance or anything like that. And if I were an end user, I would want to really understand what are, in this case, cybersecurity issues that I need to be concerned about, and get help to develop a scorecard. How are we doing today against what we should be doing? That allows you to develop a program to move you from where you are and where you don't want to be to a place that you're a little bit more safer and you should be a little bit more comfortable. But what's important is that you work with somebody that you know is competent to help guide these things. They don't have to do it for you necessarily, but these things are becoming very complicated. And so looking for expert help would be advisable.
And it looks like you're only as strong as the guiding coalition of advisors around you, whether you're a consultant, integrator, technology vendor, or end user. So this is going to be interesting to see how this all comes together. that concludes our webinar. You can reach Rodney or William through an email at info at the same URL you're seeing on the screen, thegreatconversation.com, separated by hyphens. If we don't hear from you, in the meantime, we'll see you on March 5th and 6th in Seattle, Washington for another great conversation. Thanks to Security System News and my guest speakers, and thank you very much, all you attendees. Bye for now.